Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back once again to the Siege of Vraks. Last episode, the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army finally scored a telling victory, putting an end to over a year of constant defeats and defensive battles. Under the command of their new leader, Marshal Arnim Kagori, the third defensive line was finally broken, with the aid of the Titan god machines of Legio Astorum. But when the champagne stopped flowing and the Imperial High Command could take a nice, good, long, sober look at the situation, whilst it was still true that the Imperium had scored a massive and potentially decisive victory, it was also equally clear that quite a lot of work yet remained. Over the course of the years and years of the siege, the Vraksians had filled the territory inside of the third defensive line with various forms of improvised defensive structures and fallback positions. Earthenwork bunkers side by side with freshly cast permacrete fortifications, trench lines, gun emplacement, mortar pits, artillery bunkers, barbed wire, anti-tank ditches, and miles upon miles of freshly laid minefields. When compared to the imposing fortifications of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd defensive line, these mostly improvised defences looked almost pitiful by comparison, but it was still kilometres of heavily defended terrain over which the Death Corps had to fight their way slowly and tortuously until they could finally reach the massive curtain walls of the citadel itself. And of course, every single step of that advance would also be laid bare to the guns of that very citadel. And further to the north, the battle had undergone an even more drastic transformation. The northern defensive line had been almost entirely abandoned by Vraksian PDF and auxiliary forces, left instead to the gentle administrations of the worshippers of Nurgle, who had been poisoning the ground via repeated deployments of their biological and chemical weapons. And now that the Death Corps of Krieg had started to respond in kind, the poisoning of the poor Vraksian soil had considerably increased in rapidity, turning the northern front into little more than one vast poisonous bog, lethal to all but the most heavily protected of individuals. Even Death Corps of Krieg guardsmen could only be deployed in limited periods of time, and only with mechanized transport. Anyone caught on foot in the poisonous bogs would swiftly succumb to the vile vapours steaming constantly from the brutalized soil, or maybe he would feel a tug on his ankles and swiftly thereafter be dragged down into the stinking, fetid swamp. As the northern front was increasingly becoming a haunt, not merely for the mortal worshippers of Nurgle and the Death Corps of Krieg, but also far darker powers. And so, after some admittedly deserved backclapping, it was back to work for Imperial High Command, with Marshal Arnim Kagori and his staff beginning to work out the details of his next plan. But before we have a look at that, let's take a closer look at another, oft overlooked and yet still vital and in some cases perhaps even pivotal part of the conflict: the war in the air. This part of the conflict had, as we all know by now, been opened by the opposition, as the Chaos reinforcements who arrived in orbit brought with them not only Chaos Space Marine and yet further traitors for the battlefield, but also several wings of Hell Talons and Hellblades. The arrival of these crafts had an immediate and unmistakable effect upon the battlefield. Suddenly, the Death Corps' positions could be attacked at any time and any place, and with frightening precision. Rearward supply lines that had previously been safe were now at constant risk from air attacks, with Hellblades and Helltalons swooping down from a clear sky to strafe out convoys of trucks or deliver precision ordnance on top of supply depots. It also crippled the Death Corps' ability to maneuver, as now, suddenly, any and all movement had to be undertaken under the constant cover of several batteries of Hydra AAA flak, Otherwise, the formations risked being pounced upon from the sky and annihilated in an extraordinarily one-sided engagement. And the Death Corps had to suffer under the complete air superiority of the Vraksians for a full year, until finally Marshal Kagori arrived in orbit along with the 717th Fighter Wing and the 1099th Bomber Wing. These forces were immediately sent into the battle to contest the enemy's air superiority, with the 717th Fighter Wing being placed on continuous combat air patrol over the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army's positions. Meanwhile, the bomber wings would begin launching high-altitude strikes against Vraksian defences and the suspected location of enemy airfields. The bombing campaign, however, would start out very cautiously and conservatively, simply because the logistical framework to support a major strategic bombing campaign was not yet in place. Marauder bombers can unload a truly tremendous quantity of explosives onto the foe, but that, of course, necessitates the actual existence of a truly tremendous quantity of ammunition in the first place. And whilst, of course, with the arrival of the Marshal's reinforcements, the logistical routes had once again been reopened, they were currently stretched to the limits, resupplying men and material to the 88th. The Imperial Air Force's bomber and fighter wings would have to take second priority, at least for now. But slowly but surely, as the logistical situation eased and airfields were constructed upon the planet itself, relieving the aircraft from the necessity of carrying extra fuel to ensure they could reach orbit once again once their patrols were over, the operation of the Imperial Navy's Aeronautica formations could become far more active. And with bases on the surface, the 717th could now run combat air patrols with a smaller quantity of their overall numbers, as they no longer required quite as many aircraft to go down to the surface, then operate for a very limited amount of time before having to return to orbit again, lest they run out of fuel and be forced to ditch. They could now cover the front line, as well as providing escort formations to the bomber wings. And this was fortunate indeed, because the bomber wings had been suffering quite heavily already. Even though they had limited themselves to extreme altitude bombing runs out of the effective range of most of the Vraksian anti-aircraft defences, they had still suffered heavily when met with Hell Talons and Hellblades. It had also become a necessity to expand the strategic bombing efforts of Vraks, as Marshal Arnim Kagori had pulled some serious strings indeed, and had acquired the services of a small support unit of 4 Marauder Vigilants. These are converted Marauder bombers first invented and used during the war on Armageddon against the Orc invaders. As such, they were extraordinary new entries to the Imperial Aeronautica's arsenal, and acquiring such aircraft must have required a lot of political back-scratching on behalf of the Marshal. But what exactly is the big deal? Why were these things so important, and why were they so rare? Well, their rarity is in part due to the fact that, in Imperial terms, they were a very recent invention indeed. And secondly, they were rare because they were in such incredibly high demand. The Marauder Vigilant is essentially a combination of a U-2 spy plane and an AWACS, capable of combining both the duties of an airborne early warning and control system along with that of an incredibly powerful spy plane. It is equipped with a wide array of incredibly powerful augers, both allowing it to observe the enemy's position and movements in great detail, and also a series of powerful Vox apparatus, allowing it to communicate with friendly aircraft in the vicinity. Its ability to fly at extreme altitudes while still maintaining its ability to observe accurately also allows it to cover a truly astounding amount of ground. A single one of these vehicles would be able to observe virtually the entirety of the Vraksian battlefront, and having access to 4 of them meant that Marshal Kagori could quite literally cover the entirety of the battlefront with 1 Vigilant to the north, 1 to the south, and 1 to the west and east. giving him a continuous, clear view of the entirety of the enemy's positions and maneuvers. It was via the deployment of these extraordinarily powerful command, control, and spycraft that the Marshal noticed something rather disconcerting. The enemy had apparently not simply relied upon fetching up replacement material from the huge underground bunkers beneath the citadel. Instead, they had set up a considerably sized industry around the citadel. This industry was both engaged in creating ammunition and weapons for the defenders, and also in converting various pieces of Imperial equipment brought down from below in the deep storage vaults. For example, they might take chimeras and place Hydra flak batteries on top of them to increase their numbers of mobile AAA guns. Or they might take another chassis and put an Earthshaker artillery on top of it. Or converting various types of Lehman Russ main battle tanks to fulfill other necessary battlefield roles, like the installation of a longer barrel for better anti-tank service, or the installation of the exact opposite, a shorter one for better effect against enemy infantry, and so on and so on. After receiving these reports, the Marshal decided that it would be a priority to at least interfere and possibly even destroy these industrial workings. And so the bomber wings began a high-altitude strategic bombing campaign. They were trying to fly as high as they could to avoid the worst of the Vraksian defenses, while still maintaining a certain degree of accuracy as to when and where they dropped their ordnance, but that meant that they would have to get considerably closer than they wanted to. So far, the Marauders had been skirting the very edges of the Vraksian AAA bubble, and they had already taken a bit of a mauling. Now, however, they would have to fly right across it, whilst they would still be able to maintain enough altitude to avoid the worst of the flak. The Manticore missile batteries were an entirely different proposition, and of course they would now also be flying directly on top of the bases of the Hell Talons and Hellblades that they had been fighting so far. And thusly, despite continuous fighter escorts, the casualties both amongst the bombers and the fighters escorting them after a week of operations were disturbing, to put it mildly. And it was swiftly made clear that a sustained strategic campaign was simply not possible. Instead, there would be individual and well-planned-out raids, during certain periods at which they figured the enemy would have other things to think about, where Marauders would then execute an extended period of operations against targets of interest while being escorted by practically the full force of their fighter wings. Whilst doing this, they hope to limit their casualties at least to some extent, at the very least to the extent where they can actually replace them, while still hopefully inflicting notable casualties and damage upon the industrial workers and the industrial buildings themselves. Whether or not this was necessarily a success is open to interpretation. They were slowly but surely wearing away at the enemy's numbers in the air, as to begin with, the enemy was expected to have a small superiority in aircraft, but after the campaign had been rolling on for a while and the Imperial forces had been receiving continuous reinforcements and replacement craft, the enemy, of course, had not. And so, slowly but surely, the aeronautic forces first reached parity with the enemy, and then slowly but surely started to outnumber them more and more and more. And yet, despite that fact, the rate of casualties amongst bomber crews and fighter pilots was actually higher than those of frontline infantry regiments. The rate of losses were prohibitive, and the effects were limited. But the Imperial aeronautical officers assured Marshal Arnim Kagori that they were in it for the long haul, and that the Imperial Navy stood ready to replenish any and all losses suffered throughout the duration of the campaign. Unfortunately, the continued campaign against what had been known amongst the pilots as the Hornet Nest, referring to the citadel itself, proved fairly inconclusive. Damage was most certainly done, but whether or not that damage stood in any proportion to the rate at which the Imperial Aeronautica was losing fighters and bombers is very unclear and remains a hotly debated topic amongst Imperial historians even to this day. What the campaign did achieve, however, was to inflict continuous casualties upon the Chaos forces attempting to defend the airspace above the Citadel, as the Hellblades and Helltalons found themselves needing to sortie more and more often, attacking straight into massed formations of Marauder bombers escorted by thunderbolts and lightning. This slowly but surely began to wrestle ultimate air superiority away from the Chaos forces and securely into Imperial hands. But now, after talking about the high-flying affairs of the Imperial Aeronautica, let's go in the exactly opposite direction. Indeed, as far in the opposite direction as one can possibly go. We are in fact going subterranean. Because you see, Marshal Kagori was of the opinion that his predecessor, Lord Commander Julka, had been approaching the Vraksian problem from the wrong direction. Literally. Marshal Kagori was of the opinion that, seeing as he had superior materiel and manpower, he should seek to engage the enemy on as wide a frontage as possible. But, due to the peculiar geography of Vraks, this was difficult, and due to the even more peculiar geography of the northern part of the front line, thanks to the efforts of the worshippers of Nurgle, it had been made all the more difficult as of late. The Marshal was also of the controversial opinion that men should not simply be thrown at enemy fortifications. This quaint idea of his had garnered him no small amount of derision and, in some extreme cases, discontent from the Death Corps' officer corps. But they could hardly question results, and so far Kagori, although being a bit on the cautious side for their own personal tastes, had certainly delivered, so they would probably go along with his new fanciful suggestions. Marshal Kagori was, as you can now see, of the opinion that there was a way to achieve both of his objectives, broadening the front and engaging the enemy's weakest points rather than the strongest. And as a cherry on top and a placating gesture towards the Death Corps officers, it also meant opening up a brand new area of operations, one that was extraordinarily hostile, uncomfortable, and lethal, where death waited around every corner, ready to spring forth with barely any warning whatsoever. Precisely the kind of place that the men of Krieg are so very, very fond of. And this new field of battle, of course, would be underground. The Marshal had envisioned a grand campaign of subterranean warfare, where the enemy's strongest points would be undermined and assaulted from below or simply just destroyed by the placing of large underground mines, pockets of vast quantities of high explosives to be detonated at a preordained time, taking with it both the tunnel and everything above it in an apocalyptic explosion. And additionally, as the Death Corps officers undoubtedly would be pleased to learn, this did not mean that the focus of the campaign would be shifted, or that above-ground operations would be scaled down. It meant in fact the exact opposite. Above-ground offensive operations would continue just the same, and may in fact increase in intensity, so as to ensure that the enemy would be kept in the dark for as long as possible as to the true intentions of the Marshal's new plan. And if the enemy did happen to learn about the underground efforts, that just meant that the Vraksians would now have to split their efforts between facing above-ground operations of ever-increasing intensity and the underground efforts of the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army's engineering corps. The commander of these engineers, represented here by this fine fella, was immediately ordered to set about preparing for the campaign. Unfortunately, it is not something quite so simple as just to start digging a hole. Military mining is a complicated and intricate art form, requiring a detailed knowledge of the terrain and how it might behave were one to dig a very large hole in it, and then put lots of dude inside of said hole, and maybe also start shooting at other dudes inside of said hole. As it turns out, being deep underground, in what could best be described as somewhat improvised surroundings, whilst also playing with explosives and firearms, can quite often be very detrimental to one's health. Depending on the results of the various geological surveys, the front would be broken into several different sectors. These sectors would relate to how deep and how effectively the ground could be dug into. Some areas would be subject to proper full-on offensive mining work, where the Death Corps would attempt to undermine enemy positions by digging deep underground tunnels. In other areas where the soil would not support such ambitious digging projects, they would instead dig out shallower tunnels, primarily meant for maneuvering troops in and around the defensive lines, and also connect the various dugouts to the forward offensive saps. This would allow the Death Corps to maneuver their own troops safely underground, and even more importantly, secretly, safe from the enemy's prying eyes, who was always observing the Death Corps' trench lines. And as an additional unexpected bonus, it also turned out that Vraks was actually relatively rich on subterranean sources of water. Whilst previously the entire army had to be supplied either from orbit or via the long overland road to the oceans of Vraks, where they also collected a fair bit of their food, mind you, in the form of algae production, they could now actually draw considerable quantities of necessary drinking water directly from the ground. Indeed, it was not only a bonus, it was in many cases a strict necessity, since soggy and wet mines tend to not be particularly sturdy mines. And speaking of waterlogged, you may remember, as I have told you multiple times before, that Vraks was often plagued by sudden torrential downpours, which presented a pretty large impediment to the entrepreneuring miners of the Death Corps. As I have already mentioned previously, the upper surface of Vraks was essentially a soft, porous-y, almost sand-like substance. Very nice for digging trenches in, for example, and excellently suited for shallow underground tunnels. The soil was soft and easy to dig in, and as long as you didn't dig too deep, it wasn't much of a problem either to brace it. This meant that the initial plans to dig shallow communications and travel tunnels proceeded at a breathtaking pace. Soon, almost the entirety of the 88's lines were connected via an intricate web of tunnels, both running backwards, forwards, and alongside the lines, connecting the various logistical trenches, the offensive saps, the frontline trenches, the dugouts, and the communication bunkers together in an incredibly vast spiderweb of tunnels, all of which were of course heavily guarded and interspersed with choke points, where heavy bolters and stubbers covered lengthy straight corridors, just in case the Vraxians were ever to gain entry to the network. However, that very same soft and pleasurable to dig through soil also made the digging of deeper tunnels essentially impossible, due to the sudden and constant torrential downpours and the fact that the water would simply just run straight through the ground essentially. It meant that any large-scale building project underground would quickly be filled up with water, as tunnels were flooded in mere minutes, and there simply was not enough time between the various downpours to allow the tunnels to dry out properly. This meant that not only did any building material used quickly get waterlogged, but far more importantly, it also meant that the soil itself would drastically change its proportions, its weight, its size, and its volume on almost an hourly basis, making it virtually impossible to prop up the tunnel walls, as a support that worked just fine one day might find itself under twice the pressure the next, or the walls themselves might quite literally have moved as the flows of water tore away huge chunks of the porous soil. Digging the kind of deep-running tunnels that the plan would require was not possible here. So what about even further below? Well, the soil there was heavier, thick-packed dirt and rock. This is where all of the water eventually ended up, and over the years, it had dug deep canals and caves out of the rock and earth, washing it ever further down. This was also one of the reasons for the many massive gorges on the planet. Essentially, water would pool in these areas and pool and pool and pool, and wear away at the various walls, digging huge underground caverns until eventually it had dug away enough for the whole thing to collapse. Over the course of millions of years, this had created the massive gorges that made the Vraks such a interesting place to attack. This area was better than the topmost layer because at the very least it was somewhat solid. The problem was it was also partially flooded, which meant that any attempts at mining in this area would be under constant risk of breaking through into an underwater reservoir, which would instantaneously flood the tunnel in question. There was also the constant danger of collapse. No matter how well braced the tunnel would be, there was never really any real way of knowing whether or not several hundred tons of water was directly on top of a particular tunnel, or when that water decided that it had finally had enough of the small hollow space beneath it and simply collapsed down into it. And so, whilst it would be possible to dig here, it was still far, far, far from ideal, and any introduction of heavy machinery would be, well, it would speed things up, but it would also make the likelihood of collapse increase drastically, which, at the end of the day, would make the whole exercise somewhat pointless. Right, so the topmost layer is no good, and beneath that is no good either. What if we go properly deep? Really, really deep? Until we basically hit nothing but solid rock. Well, this is what they did, and eventually they hit a layer that was essentially just solid bedrock. Now, this, whilst it was going to be a bit to dig through, was considerably better for many reasons. One, it was not flooded, which meant it was actually possible to keep it relatively dry. Two, it was unlikely to collapse in on itself if properly braced. And due to the solidity of the surrounding rocks, it meant that larger tunnels could be created, more equipment could be brought down, and more troops could be moved at once. It also simplified the deployment of large digging machinery, although the deployment of any such mechanisms would also almost certainly get rid of any element of surprise if the enemy was listening out at all, since they would be creating quite the ruckus. And they were not, strictly speaking, necessary. They would certainly speed things up, but the rock was still soft enough to be hewn with pickaxes. It would be slow, it would be dirty, and it would be exhausting, especially since at this point they would be so far down that a steady supply of oxygen would have to be pumped down from the surface, further complicating things and making an already extraordinarily uncomfortable place to work even worse. And allow me to assure you that working down in these mines would have been nothing short of hell. First and foremost, you are swinging essentially what is a primitive pickaxe, a form that has remained virtually unchanged for millions of years against a solid rock face for hours at a time. And all of the time you're doing this, you're constantly heaving for air, gasping for breath, as the machines can never seem to pump quite enough oxygen down into the deep tunnels. It might even get so bad that the Death Corps engineers might start considering to remove their gas masks, an unthinkable act in any other circumstance. And then of course there's the fact that every time you swing at the solid rock face in front of you, you knock loose chips of rocks, you create sparks. You create rock dust swirling around you, getting in your hair, getting on your skin, maybe getting in your mouth and eyes if you should be tempted to remove your gas mask and you feel that the closest quartermaster is just far enough away not to notice in the deep, uncomfortable darkness of the mine. And then there's the temperature. It would be unbearably hot at almost all times. The machines pumping air down into the mine would also be cooling it from surface levels, bringing it down from what was a life-threatening 50 to 60 degrees to a tolerable-ish 30 to 40. And then of course there's the moisture. Whilst these deeper mines were much, much, much drier than the upper ones, they were still not entirely dry. And then of course there's the fact that you have hundreds, maybe thousands of men working around the clock in high temperatures, sweating buckets continuously. And the only means of getting that stale, dead air out, of course, would be to pump it back up again, through the same overstrained systems that is so desperately attempting to pump fresh, cool air down into the mines below. And just as one tiny little extra detail, just to add an extra little pinch of hell to the proceedings, the Death Corps engineers also occasionally ran into the remains of long-dormant volcanic activity, which had left behind pockets of super-hard granite-like rock, which was simply impossible to tunnel through without the employment of blasting charges, the size of which would rather clearly reveal the tunnel, not only to anybody listening, but anybody watching from the fucking surface. Can you imagine the sheer quantity of frustration? You've been digging a tunnel for weeks, maybe months, it's been hell every single step of the way. You've got trouble breathing, you're constantly sweating, you're not allowed to remove your uniform or your gas mask, lest you get whipped by the quartermaster. And then, suddenly, you run into a rock face so ridiculously hard and impenetrable that the only thing you can do is grab your kit, walk all the way back down the tunnel you spent weeks and months digging, climb your way back up to the surface, and then start digging a brand new hole from square one. If it was any other Imperial Guard regiment, Marshal Kagori would almost certainly have had a bloody riot on his hands, but the Death Corps of Krieg, they see this kind of suffering and horror and smile inwardly, knowing that their ultimate sacrifice will be made all the more valuable, all the sweeter, in fact, for their temporary suffering in this life. But, at least now that it had been made clear that mining operations was feasible, they could be started on a large scale. First and foremost, the Death Corps engineer officers would pick the locations of the various mine entrances. Then, if it was a smaller mine, they would be located relatively close to the front line, usually behind trenches or dugouts, so as to simulate an air of normality, and to hide the fact that there wasn't actually a mine there. Whilst the larger mines would have to be crafted into the terrain itself, a small rise perhaps, a hill, or maybe even an observation tower that had been built up. Anything and everything to disguise the entrances and therefore extend the period of surprise, as it was expected that the enemy would have plenty of personnel capable of burrowing down and facing the Death Corps underground. After all, the defenders of Vraks included the Labour Auxilia, whose very job it was to build new underground storage depots for all of the various Imperial war gear stored on the planet. Once a position was chosen, the initial shaft would then be lowered into the ground. It would be braced as it went by teams of engineers. Progress through the upper layer was as usual swift. Progress through the second layer somewhat less so, but still quite easy and feasible. This and the upper layer would also require additional bracing and waterproofing, so that the water from these layers would not simply seep down into the tunnel below. Finally, upon reaching the solid rock layer, progress would almost entirely halt, until heavier equipment could be brought down and teams of workers could be kept on constant shifts to keep hacking away at the rock face. Once a cut had been made into the rock, the shaft itself would be reinforced with permacrete, freeing up the need to constantly waterproof it. Then, power cables would be run down the sides and ventilation systems installed. From there on out, it was mostly a question of good old-fashioned raw muscle power, as the Death Corps hacked away at the rock face in front of them, only occasionally interrupted by meddlesome officers who came to take readings and measurements to ensure the tunnel kept on the correct course. Occasionally, the mining would also have to be halted for periods to allow the installation of further power cables and yet more ventilation devices. The most time-consuming pause, however, would be if they ran into a particularly wet segment, which would then have to be reinforced with permacrete bracings, creating small permacrete tunnels within the mine itself, so as to ensure that it would not get flooded accidentally. It also proved necessary to install pumps to remove any excess water that still made its way into the tunnels, which required the laying out of yet more power cables. And finally, a small rail system would be installed. This rail system would be powered by small but powerful electrical motors, which drove carts up and down the rail lines, allowing the engineers to load the carts full of rocks, dirt, and other refuse and sent back down the line all the way to the exit, where the cart would be taken off the rails, hoisted up out of the shaft, and dumped topside. The concealment of such huge quantities of rocks and dirt quickly became a bit of a problem. A lot of it was of course used to fill sandbags used in the front lines, but there were also huge quantities of rocks, most of which were broken up and used to gravel some of the rearward roads, for example. But the sheer quantity of soil produced by the various mines quickly became a bit of a problem, and High Command had to get rather innovative when it came to disposing of it. And of course, the digging of the tunnels themselves were no easy matter whatsoever. Underground, as you can probably imagine, you quickly lose any and all sense of direction, and as such, watchmasters and quartermasters had to constantly watch and judge the direction of the tunnels to ensure that it kept on a steady course. Additionally, they also had to continuously plan out the size, the scope, and the necessities of the tunnels, when they needed additional pumps, when they needed additional air pumped down from the surface, when they needed additional cooling, when they needed additional power lines, when the tunnels needed to be expanded upon, when they needed to make cutouts into the tunnels themselves to create little storage areas for spare parts, for example, or emergency medical centres, or storage areas, or marshalling yards, etc. Eventually, of course, the tunnels would start out nice and narrow, but as they progressed, they would be widened and expanded upon, until heavy equipment could eventually be brought down if necessary, and also, furthermore, to facilitate the movement of troops, if that too should become necessary. All in all, progress was slow, but steady. The Death Corps of Krieg was probably the finest troops in most of the galaxy, honestly, to carry out such a large-scale underground mining operation, and, as of yet, they were undisturbed by enemy action, because whilst water, because whilst heat, because whilst oxygen and all of these things can be annoyances, they are relatively easy to deal with. An enemy trying to countermine you, to place bombs in your path, to try and collapse your mines, to try and break into them with shotguns and las pistols and chainswords. That is the kind of stuff that is considerably more difficult to deal with. And I think we'll wrap this episode up right around here, because I feel like I've kind of gotten into the groove of a little bit of a building up administrative episode, and then a bit more of an actiony episode. And now that I've told you how the Death Corps were digging their mines and why, I think the next one will pertain to what happened when the Vraxians found out that the enemy was very industriously indeed digging happy little tunnels beneath their homeland. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.